When Gu Yixun was down and out in his youth, it was always me by his side. Later, when he made his mark in the world, he married his widowed sister-in-law. When busybodies asked for my take on it, I just smiled and said, may they grow old together in wedded bliss. It was the day Gu Yixun got engaged to Song Xiyao. I was working as an extra on a film set, holding a cold boxed meal in my hands, which were covered in chilled lanes from the bitter cold. I looked up and there, on the giant commercial LED screen at Century Square, was a bright, happy wedding photo of him and Song Xiyao. To curry favor with the boss, the folks running the place were offering a limited number of lifetime membership cards. Word had it you couldn't get one no matter how much money you threw at it. Scarce as hen's teeth, they were only given to families on good terms with the Gus, a symbol of status. I had one. Song Xiao had sent it to me whether as a provocation or a brag. I couldn't say. Attached to the card was a note, scrawled in gaudy, gilded red ink. In celebration of our boss's wedding, your presence is requested to share the joy. What a tacky slogan. Yet beneath that tackiness, there was an unmistakable glow of happiness. I thought back to a long time ago, when Gu Yixun was still down on his luck. It was my birthday, and he'd asked what I wanted. We were standing outside a cake shop, our reflections staring back at us from the huge shop window. Inside, exquisite cakes were on display. I pointed at a wedding sale poster the shopkeeper had put up by the door and smiled. Put it on credit for now, okay? When you're rich someday, will you open a cake shop for me? That way, when I get married, I can hang a banner outside that says boss's wedding big sale. I looked at him, eyes shining with longing. Gu Yixun stared down at me silent. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. In the end, I turned my head away, pretending not to care, as if he'd agreed. But I'd been fooling myself all along. I clutched a card, staring blankly at their wedding photo on the LED screen, until Zhao, another extra on set, walked over. Her eyes lit up when she saw the card in my hand. Wow! Lin Ji, where on earth did you get this? You're amazing. She paused, then snapped her fingers as if something had just clicked. Oh, did Mr. Gu give it to you? Is it hush money? Her voice was bristling with indignation. No way. He dumped you to marry his own widowed sister-in-law, and now he has the nerve to send you something this cruel? What a total jerk. Her righteous anger would have been touching if she hadn't had it. This thing's so hurtful. You must not want to look at it or use it, right? Why don't you give it to me? I'll take it off your hands. My heart sank. I tossed her the card, then hung my head and picked at my cold, hard-boxed meal as she gushed her thanks. Everyone knew Gu Yixun and I had been together. After all, he'd once doted on me so openly. Everyone could see it. Zhao took the card away, her elation fading. She looked at me and sighed for some reason. I've never seen anyone as stupid as you. If that were me, I'd never leave him, not even if he threatened me with a knife. I speared a cold chunk of potato from my meal and smiled. I'd heard those exact words 100 times when I'd decided to walk away from Gu Yixun. I'd first gotten together with Gu Yixun right after he'd lost a brutal power struggle for the position of the Gu family's head. He'd been exiled to Jiangkang, handed the reins of a money-bleeding subsidiary, drowning in tens of millions of debt, cut off completely from the family's core businesses. To make matters worse, Song Xiao, the girl he'd grown up with, his one true love, had married his cousin Gu Yao, the man who'd beaten him to the top. She'd become his sister-in-law, the young mistress of the Gu household. When the tree falls, the monkeys scatter, and everyone had abandoned him. I'd met him at a business dinner in Jiangkang. My agent had sent me to schmooze the clients. It wasn't exactly a casting couch situation. Just a case of using pretty girls to liven up the party. And me? I had nothing to my name but my looks. Gu Yixun had been negotiating a deal with some local Jiangkang gangsters, dressed in a black shirt. Even at his lowest point, he carried himself with a quiet, unshakable elegance. The gangster boss, a man with a face full of fat, had pointed at the wine in front of Gu Yixun and smirked. Master Gu, don't say I'm not giving you a fair shot. Everyone knows you may still have the Gu surname, but in this family, you're worth less than nothing. What makes you think you can do business with me? Tell you what, drink all this wine, and we'll see how sincere you really are. Gu Yixun had lifted his eyes to glance at him, then picked up the bottle and started drinking. He was drinking like a man with a death wish. Lucky for him, it was early in the dinner, and there were only 2 bottles of red wine on the table. After he'd finished them, the gangster boss laughed and shouted to the waiter, "Did you see that? Our Master Gu's still thirsty. Go open 20 more bottles, mix red, white, and beer. Bring 'em all." I smiled, stood up, and said, "I'll help carry them over." No one paid the slightest attention to the interruption. So while no one was looking, I dumped all the white wine down the drain and refilled the bottles with water. There was nothing I could do about the red wine and beer, but at least I could rig the white. Gu Yixun had paused for a split second when he took his first sip of the white wine, then shot me a subtle, unreadable glance. Later, Gu Yixun had drunk the gangster boss under the table. When the crowd finally dispersed, I dragged him back to his place, dead drunk and barely conscious. He was surprisingly quiet when he was wasted, his face pale as a sheet. In the middle of the night, he'd woken up and stumbled to the bathroom to throw up. I'd stood outside the door, holding a warm towel, waiting for him. His bangs had fallen over his forehead, his handsome face cold and distant, as if he wanted to push the entire world away. He'd shot me a frosty look and said, "You're wasting your time with me. I have nothing to give you." What had I said back then? Oh, right, I'd just smiled, unfazed. He had no idea the secret thrill that had fluttered in the deepest corner of my heart. God knew, with his icy, unapproachable personality, I would have never had a chance to get close to him if he hadn't been at rock bottom. I held out the warm towel to him, smiling softly. "Master Gu, my name is Lin Ji." His dark eyes had locked onto mine, sharp and searching. Finally, he said with certainty, "We've met before, haven't we?" He didn't remember me, but that was only natural after all. The last time I'd seen him, he'd still been one of the front runners for the Gu family headship. A golden boy, untouchable high above the clouds. And me? I'd been nothing more than a speck of dust. I'd smiled at his question and said, "It doesn't matter if you don't remember. Let's start over. My name is Lin Ji." He'd gripped the towel, staring at me, his eyebrows furrowing slightly as he fell into thought. Later, when Gu Yixun had clawed his way back to the top and reclaimed control of the Gu family, everyone had praised me for my foresight sticking by him when he was down and out, so I could finally climb the Phoenix's branch when he made it big. After all, as a no-name, C-list model, I'd never have even gotten the chance to talk to someone like Gu Yixun otherwise. The closest I'd ever been to Gu Yixun was during those 5 years in Jiangkang. He'd had nothing back then, nothing but that crumbling subsidiary, and yet he'd been determined to turn it around. He'd been living in a shabby apartment in the city's run-down village, and every day I'd gone to his place to cook, clean, and do his laundry. He'd always frowned and refused my help, his voice cold and distant. "You don't have to do this. I can't give you anything in return." I just smiled at him. I'd brought him late-night snacks, waited for him outside his office in the pouring rain with an umbrella, stayed by his side when he got drunk, and even acted as his company's receptionist when he had clients over. His entire staff had only been 3 people. After all, he'd never given me a clear answer about us. Before long, everyone in Jiangkang was talking about it, the down on his luck young master of the Gu family being fawned over by a pretty little model. People had snickered, saying that even though Gu Yixun had hit rock bottom, he still had the luck with the ladies. Once, during a business negotiation, the big client had somehow heard about our arrangement. Out of a mix of malice and curiosity, he demanded to meet me, saying he wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Gu Yixun had ignored the request, but his admin assistant had called me secretly, her voice urgent. "This deal is make or break for the company. If we can sign it, it might just be the push we need to get back on our feet." So I'd gone. I'd forced a smile as the client's hand slid up my thigh, biting my tongue to keep from pushing him away until Gu Yixun had appeared out of nowhere, grabbed a beer bottle, and smashed it over the man's head. Needless to say, the deal had fallen through, and he'd made yet another enemy. Later, as he'd stormed back to the office, I'd stumbled after him, stammering apologies. I'm so sorry, I just wanted to help. I never meant for things to get this out of hand." He'd stopped short, and I'd crashed into his back before I could stop myself. When he turned to face me, it was the first time he'd ever called me by my name. "Lin Ji," he'd said, his voice tight with anger. "I'm not mad about the deal falling through. I'm mad that you'd let yourself be treated like this. He only wanted to touch your leg this time. But what if he'd said he'd sign the contract if you slept with him? Would you have done it then?" "I would have," I'd said, looking him straight in the eye. He'd stared at me, stunned like he'd never met anyone so unprincipled. I'd fought back tears and repeated myself, my voice steady. "I would have done it. Anything to help you." He'd looked at me for a long time, then said, slowly and deliberately, "Are you out of your mind?" I'd laughed. "It doesn't matter anyway, you don't like me. Life's too short. only about 30,000 days. I'm just borrowing this body of mine, aren't I? If it's just a body, what's there to care about? He'd sucked in a sharp breath, his eyes fixed on me. Finally, he'd said, each word heavy with resolve, Lin Ji, I'm not going to lose forever. I know, I'd replied. Of course he wouldn't lose. I'd always believed that. After that day, I'd become his friend, if you could even call it that. He'd started accepting my kindness, letting me clean his apartment, cook his meals, stock his fridge with food. He'd had no one else, only me. We'd eaten dinner together sometimes, and after he closed a deal, he'd buy me small, thoughtful gifts, nothing expensive, just things I needed. When I'd complained about someone harassing me on set, he'd even taken the time to drive me to and from work every day. The ice around his heart had cracked, just a little. I'd thought someday he'll fall in love with me. I'd waited for that day hopeful. We'd grown closer and closer as time went on. There were moments when I'd even convinced myself that Gu Yixun had already fallen for me. It was his second year in Jiangkang. He'd landed a huge client in North America, but he'd been short on the upfront capital he needed to seal the deal. He'd tried everything he could think of. I'd taken every penny I had saved up, put it in a bank card, and handed it to him. He'd glanced at it, then accepted it without a word. But we'd still been 2 million yuan short. 2 million yuan. A drop in the bucket for the Gu Yixun of today, but back then, it had been the final straw threatening to break him. I'd never seen him look so defeated. No matter how bad things got, he'd always been calm, always looking for a way out. But the night before the contract was due to be signed, he'd sat on the balcony, smoking a cigarette, and sighed. Lin Ji, is fate just playing a joke on me? Why do I always fall just one step short? I'd looked at him, then turned and walked out the door. I'd gone to find Zhang Yan, the wealthy second-generation playboy who'd been chasing after me for months. I'd unbuttoned the last button of my shirt, my hands shaking so badly I could barely move when he'd suddenly stopped me. He'd sat up, pulled a blanket over me, and said, I don't like forcing people. I'd opened my eyes to find him staring at me, amused. I've had every kind of woman thrown at me. I don't need to sleep with someone who doesn't want me. Besides, your devotion to Gu Yixun is actually kind of touching. He'd sighed. If a woman ever loved me as much as you love him, I hope she'd find someone who deserves her. He hadn't touched me. Instead, he'd tossed me a bank card and smiled. Tell Gu Yixun this is an investment from me. If he ever makes it back to the Gu family, tell him to return the favor someday. I thanked him, but he just waved me off, easy and carefree. Before I left, he'd given me a piece of advice. Lin Ji, a woman's youth doesn't last forever. Think carefully about what you're doing. I'd said nothing. When I'd handed the bank card to Gu Yixun, he'd stared at me for a long time. Then suddenly, he'd pulled me into a tight hug. I'd heard him whisper, his voice thick with emotion, Lin Ji, I owe you so much. How can I ever repay you? He'd never understood. I'd done everything willingly. I'd never expected anything in return. That money had been the first ray of light in his journey back to the top. It had taken Gu Yixun only 5 years to go from exile to reclaiming control of the Gu family's core businesses. In 5 years, he'd turned that dying subsidiary from a debt-ridden mess into a cash cow with over 100 million yuan in annual profits, earning himself a seat at the Gu family's boardroom table. In contrast, his cousin Gu Yao had proven to be a hopeless leader. He'd been tricked by his so-called friends into gambling abroad, and in his desperation, he'd even wagered the Gu family's ancestral home. It was Gu Yixun who'd gone in alone and won it back. When he'd slammed the deed to the ancestral home onto the solid wood table in the boardroom, the entire room had gone dead silent. Moments later, the vote had been unanimous. Gu Yixun was named the new head of the Gu family. As for Gu Yao, he'd been left a broken man. Not long after, he'd gotten drunk, raced his car, and died in a horrific crash. The Gu family's power struggle, which had dragged on for years, had finally come to an end. When people gossiped about the Gu family's changing of the guard, they always brought me up. They'd said the real winner of the power struggle wasn't Gu Yixun, it was me. Everyone thought Gu Yixun and I had gotten together when he was at his lowest, but that wasn't true. We'd only started dating after he'd made his comeback and returned to the Gu family. It had been on the top floor of the Gu family's towering headquarters building. Gu Yixun had looked at me and said, I won. I'd nodded. Then he'd said, stay with me, Lin Ji, forever. I'd said yes. At that moment, I'd thought my patience had finally paid off, that he'd finally been moved by my love for him. Until later, in the Gu family's garden, I'd seen Song Xiyao throw herself into Gu Yixun's arms, sobbing. His hand had hovered in the air, then fallen limply to his side. He'd stood there stiff and unresponsive, letting her cling to him. That was when I'd finally had to admit the truth: he'd never loved me. I'd seen it in his eyes the first time I'd met Song Xiyao, when I'd accompanied him back to the Gu family mansion as his girlfriend. He'd still been in love with her, even though she'd abandoned him when he was at his lowest, marrying his cousin. He'd still loved her. Memories always leave a bitter taste in your mouth. By the time I got to the film set the next day, it was almost noon. But luck was on my side: the crew hadn't started filming yet, because some VIP had shown up unexpectedly. Dressed in a filthy, tattered beggar costume, I grabbed my box meal and huddled in a corner with the other extras dressed as beggars. I'd never expected to see Gu Yixun again. After all, he was newly married. I'd assumed he and Song Xiyao were off on a honeymoon in some romantic country. But there he was, on the film set. He was surrounded by a crowd of people, the director bowing and scraping at his side. I wouldn't have been surprised if he was the one who'd funded the movie. He stood there untouchable, the center of attention. His features were still as handsome as ever, but his demeanor had grown more reserved, more inscrutable. His eyebrows were furrowed, his expression dark, nothing like a man who'd just married the love of his life. Why was he so unhappy? Hadn't he gotten everything he'd ever wanted, marrying his childhood sweetheart, his white Moonlight? I hid in the crowd, staring at him openly. As if he'd sensed my gaze, his eyes suddenly shot in my direction, sharp and alert. I quickly lifted my box meal to cover my face. The air around me went dead silent. I couldn't see a thing, my view blocked by the meal box, until I heard a familiar, strained voice speaking from above me. "Lin Ji, how did you end up like this? Who did this to you?" I slowly lowered the meal box and looked up. He was towering over me, his eyebrows drawn tightly together. He held out a hand to me, his face expressionless. "Who did this to you?" I said nothing. He pressed on, his voice colder than ice. "Was it Song Xiyao?" His face gave nothing away, but when our eyes met, I saw the rage burning in his. He was furious. Even though he hadn't married me, he'd never tolerated anyone hurting me. Gu Yixun had always felt like he owed me something. He'd actually planned to marry me after he'd asked me to stay with him. Now that I thought about it, even though he'd broken my heart later, he'd treated me well when we were together. He was a germaphobe, but he'd never hesitated to finish the seafood rice I'd left behind. He had a terrible temper, but he'd always looked at me with a soft, gentle smile. When I'd accidentally smashed his antique vase worth millions of yuan, he'd only cared about whether the shards had cut my feet. When people had tried to curry favor with him by sending women to his door, he'd turned them all away without a second glance. Before long, everyone had known he wanted nothing to do with anyone else. Back then, everyone had thought he was madly in love with me. Only I knew the truth. I knew he'd sit on the balcony smoking cigarettes late at night, watching Song Xiao's name flash repeatedly on his phone screen. He'd never answer her calls, but he'd never hang up on her either. I'd understood Gu Yixun in my own way. Song Xiao had been his white Moonlight, his first love. When she'd betrayed him at the height of their romance, he'd never gotten over it. He hated her. Of course he did, but that hatred was forever tangled up with the love he'd felt for her, frozen in time on the day she'd married his cousin. It had been my birthday the day he'd planned to propose to me. Then Song Xiyao had called him and tried to kill herself. By the time he'd gotten back from the hospital, midnight had long since passed. Looking at his face, I'd known Song Xiyao had won her bet. Gu Yixun had caved. I'd sat at the dining table, the table laden with fine wine and delicious food, untouched. I'd eaten the entire 18-inch cake by myself, spoonful by spoonful. The cake was sweet, but it had tasted like ash in my mouth. Gu Yixun had stood there, watching me silently, until I'd taken the last bite. Then he'd finally spoken, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry." I'd looked up at him and asked, "Gu Yixun, do you still love her?" He'd said nothing, but I'd once read a saying: sometimes silence is an answer in itself. So I'd smiled and said, "I see. I'll leave. I know when I'm not wanted." He hadn't tried to stop me, but as we'd walked past each other, he'd grabbed my wrist. I'd heard him whisper the words again. "I'm sorry." It was funny, really. The great head of the Gu family, he'd probably only ever said those 3 words to me in his entire life. But I'd never wanted his apology. When I'd walked away, everyone had called me a fool. Gu Yixun had sent people to look after me, given me a huge sum of money, but I'd vanished from his life completely, without a trace, as if I'd never existed at all. Until today. He stood in front of me now, looking at my ragged appearance, and said, "I tried to find you, but your phone number was disconnected. I thought you never wanted to see me again. Until your agent called." He paused, then asked, What did you do with the money I gave you? I wasn't some noble hermit, refusing to bend my knee for money. But Song Xiao, now the new young mistress of the Gu family, had frozen the bank card he'd given me. The Gu family's bank had never dared to cross her. Gu Yixun's eyebrows furrowed deeper as I stayed silent. Then, in full view of everyone, he grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. His voice sharp. Come with me. I wrenched my arm free. I smiled at him as he stared at me in shock, my expression cold, distant, polite, keeping him at a careful, deliberate distance. I reminded him softly but firmly, Gu Yixun, you're married now. I can't stay with you anymore. You've already lost me. His face darkened instantly. For a split second, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. Maybe he hadn't even noticed it himself. My agent called me 3 days later, by which time my stint as a beggar extra had already wrapped. I was eating instant noodles in my shabby rental flat. On the other end of the line, he said, Lin Ji, you won the bet. I don't know the full story, but word is Gu Yixun's frozen all of Song Xiao's bank cards. He hasn't even spent a single night at the Gu family's ancestral mansion, apparently. Rumor has it he's been holed up at the group headquarters this whole time. I laughed and thanked him. Yes, that call my agent made to Gu Yixun had been my idea. Ever since I'd left Gu Yixun, Song Xiao had been scheming against me behind his back. I couldn't land any acting gigs. My bank cards were frozen. And she'd even pressured my company to send me to sleazy dinner parties with powerful men, the kind where casting couches were the norm. No one dared to follow through, though. Everyone was too afraid of Gu Yixun. My agent had looked thoroughly put upon when he'd said to me, Lin Ji, why don't you call Gu Yixun and tell him what she's doing? Blow the whistle on her. I'd laughed for some reason, then comforted him gently. It's fine. You don't want to cross her. Just do whatever she tells you except send me to those dinners. I'm not going to those. He sighed. Even if you did go, no one would dare lay a finger on you. Everyone knows you're Gu Yixun's woman. I'd fallen silent. I'd played right into Song Xiao's hands, taking extra roles, living in a run-down rental, broke and destitute. And when I'd hit rock bottom, my agent had finally called Gu Yixun, sounding like he was sticking up for me. That was why Gu Yixun had shown up on set and seen me in that sorry state. And sure enough, he'd flown into a rage. I'd known he would. Even if Gu Yixun didn't love me, I'd always held a special place in his heart. Distance tests a horse's stamina. Time reveals a person's true character. Those 5 years I'd spent by his side, through thick and thin, no one could ever take that away from me. I'd gambled on it. Gambled that he'd lose his temper. If this were a novel, I'd be the conniving female villain, the scheming manipulator who mastered the art of taking a step back to gain the upper hand. Sometimes when I looked in the mirror, I even disgusted myself. But if I had to do it all over again, I'd still drive a wedge between them. No one knew what happened after I'd walked away from Gu Yixun, pretending to be fine and telling him I knew when to quit. As soon as I turned my back, tears had streamed down my face. I declutched a ring he'd planned to propose with so tightly my knuckles turned white, crying until my chest ached. Why me? Why did I have to be the one to step aside? It was her who'd left him for money and status. It was me who'd stayed by his side through everything. I'd done everything for Gu Yixun willingly, no strings attached. But if fate was going to dangle that dream in front of me, why did it have to snatch it away just as I was about to reach it? We'd been so close. So close. He'd almost been mine. Why did I have to be the sensible one? Why did I have to be the one to walk away? Why did I have to be the one left with nothing to show for it? Why did his precious white Moonlight get to win without lifting a finger, while I gave everything and got nothing in return? Why did I have to pack my bags and leave just because he was still in love with Song Xiyao? Why did they get a second chance at happiness, while I was left to watch them from afar, forcing myself to move on for the rest of my life? Let someone else play the martyr. I refused. I was angry, resentful, unwilling to accept defeat. I had to see if I could rewrite my fate, to reach for the moon that had always hung just out of my grasp. I remembered when I left Gu Yixun, everyone around me had tried to talk me out of it. You stuck with him through his worst days. You don't have to hand him over to someone else now that he has made it big. Are you crazy? So what if he doesn't love you? Love doesn't pay the bills. Do you have any idea how many billions he's worth now? Everyone had told me to stay for the money, because as long as I didn't leave him, Gu Yixun would never have the heart to let me go. But if I'd only cared about money, would I have stayed by his side when he was at his lowest? When I walked away, everyone called me foolish, naive. Only I knew the truth. I was gambling. Gambling that Gu Yixun didn't love Song Xiao as much as he thought he did. gambling that I'd left a deeper mark on his heart than he was willing to admit. So I let him go. I gave him the perfect excuse to marry Song Xiyao. The moon that had hung so brightly in his memories would lose its glow once he finally had it in his grasp. He'd realized she wasn't the same person he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Only by letting him have her could the love and hatred he'd bottled up for so long finally start to unfreeze. Would those feelings come flooding back? Or would they slowly dry up and disappear? That was my bet. I gambled that once he got his precious white Moonlight back, the idealized love he'd clung to for so long would fade away. That the day-to-day reality of being with Song Xiyao would constantly remind him of her betrayal. And only then would he think of me, of the woman who'd stayed by his side through thick and thin. The moment Song Xiyao came to me, I knew I was going to win. I'd crossed paths with Song Xiyao a few times before. She hated me. Of course she did. Our first encounter was right after I'd gotten together with Gu Yixun. She'd shown up at our door, asking Gu Yixun for living expenses. Yes, now that Gu Yixun was the head of the Gu family and her husband was dead, she needed his approval for every single expense. I'd been itching to get back at her for everything she'd done, so I'd let my words drip with sarcasm, my tone dripping with disdain. I'd looked her up and down, sneering. 50,000 yuan? I'd held up my hand, showing off my elaborately manicured nails studded with fake diamonds, and smiled sweetly. Really? The great young mistress of the Gu family, begging her brother-in-law for a lousy 50 grand. The fake diamond on my nail is worth more than that. It had been a cheap costume jewel. 5 yuan for a whole bag. I just wanted to see her squirm. She'd been so furious her face turned white, storming out of the apartment without another word. I'd called after her. What's wrong? Not taking the money? Such a temper. Our second run-in was at the Gu family's ancestral mansion. Gu Yixun's mother had heard rumors that her son was whipped by a nobody model, and she'd invited me to a family dinner specifically to put me in my place. She was a glamorous, elegant woman, exactly the kind of wealthy matriarch you saw in TV dramas. The dining table was loaded with expensive dishes, and the room was filled with relatives. But there was no seat for me. She'd taken the hand of a rich socialite sitting beside her, smiling at me as she said, "Miss Lin, I'm so sorry. It completely slipped my mind to prepare a seat for you. That socialite was the woman Gu Yixun's mother wanted him to marry, someone from a family of equal standing. A perfect match in every way." Song Xiyao had sat at the table, shooting me a venomous smile. That was when Gu Yixun walked in. His expression was neutral as usual, but the moment he stepped through the door, the entire room went silent. Everyone scrambled to give him the seat of honor at the head of the table. He'd sat down slowly, adjusting his shirt cuffs with deliberate calm before saying, "Why is everyone so quiet?" It sounded like quite the party in here before I arrived. No one dared to speak. His mother forced a smile, saying, "We all know Miss Lin is the apple of your eye, so we wanted to invite her to dinner to get to know her better." Gu Yixun laughed, his gaze sweeping the room. "If she's the apple of my eye, then this is how you treat my guests. Are you trying to humiliate her to spite me? Or do you just not care about my feelings at all?" His mother's face drained of color. The butler, looking pale as a ghost, rushed to add an extra chair. Gu Yixun smiled and waved me over. "Come here, sit next to me." I'd walked over and sat down beside him, under the watchful eyes of everyone in the room, each of them thinking their own thoughts. Then I'd looked up and shot Song Xiyao a brilliant, triumphant smile. Those had been the only 2 times I'd ever gotten the better of her, until the day I'd seen her throw herself into Gu Yixun's arms in the garden. After that, I never stood a chance against her. So when she suddenly slapped me across the face, I was caught completely off guard. "Lin Ji, you scheming bitch!" Song Xiao snarled, flanked by 2 bodyguards, looking like a spoiled princess. Her makeup was flawless, but her face was tired and haggard. "You played this little game of pretending to leave so well, didn't you?" I said nothing, my eyes drifting past her to Gu Yixun, who stood behind her. His face was dark with anger. When his gaze fell on my red, stinging cheek, he hesitated for a split second, then grabbed Song Xiyao by the arm, his voice cold. "Have you had enough?" The scene that followed was chaos. I stood off to the side, holding my cheek, watching them like a stranger. Song Xiyao clung to Gu Yixun's shirt, sobbing pitifully. "Zun, you never used to be like this. Why have you changed? It's her or me. Choose." Gu Yixun sighed. I heard him say, "Song Xiao, I was wrong." A flicker of a smile crossed Song Xiao's face until he went on, "I was so obsessed with marrying you because of a childish memory. You were right. I have changed." He turned to look at me, his eyes deep and unreadable. Lin Ji, go home first. I need to take care of something. I never found out what happened next. Gu Yixun shielded me from all of it. All I heard was that he'd called off the wedding with Song Xiyao. When my agent called to congratulate me on their split, I'd gone to the balcony with a bottle of wine, feeling numb. I should have been happy, but my chest felt hollow, like a cold wind was blowing through it endlessly. I asked my agent, "Am I a terrible person?" After a long pause, he replied, "Lin Ji, everyone looks out for themselves. That's just human nature." I said nothing. If I told him I hadn't done it for myself, he'd never believe me. If Gu Yixun had fallen in love with anyone else, I would have walked away gracefully. But Song Xiao didn't deserve him. That was the truth. When Gu Yixun and Song Xiao got engaged, my agent asked me if I hated him. I didn't. I only felt sorry for him. Gu Yixun was undeniably brilliant and wealthy, but I was probably the only person in the world who knew about his miserable childhood. That was why I understood his obsession with Song Xiao. It was a cliché childhood sweetheart story, except Song Xiao had been the childhood sweetheart of his cousin, Gu Yao. Back then, Gu Yixun had been just another overlooked kid from a minor branch of the Gu family, invisible among all the other relatives. The Gu family was a complicated, cutthroat place. Gu Yixun's father had died when he was young, leaving him and his mother to fend for themselves in the sprawling Gu mansion, where they were constantly bullied. His mother was weak and timid, always scrambling to curry favor with the head of the family, Gu Yixun's uncle, and his cousin Gu Yao, while paying no attention to her own son. I'd seen the old scars on his body, souvenirs from the countless fights he'd gotten into as a child. That was why no one understood how a man as powerful as Gu Yixun was such a skilled fighter. Once, he'd watched a scene from a show I'd acted in, where a supporting character was cornered and beaten up by a group of thugs. The character had just curled up on the ground and taken it, hugging his head and saying nothing. Gu Yixun had scoffed, pointing at the screen. "I used to get beaten up like that all the time, but after I turned 16, no one could lay a hand on me." His body was covered in old wounds, each one a reminder of those difficult years. And the ringleader of those bullies had been his cousin, Gu Yao. Even as a child, Gu Yixun had been fierce and stubborn, never one to back down from a fight. But he'd always been outnumbered, and he'd always come out on the losing side. The first time he'd met Song Xiao, he'd just been beaten up by Gu Yao and his friends. She'd approached him and handed him a band-aid, smiling gently. "You should clean your wounds right away," she'd said, her voice soft and kind. It had been the first ray of warmth he'd ever felt in his life. Even later, he'd found out the truth. That day had been Gu Yao's grandfather's 70th birthday, and Song Xia had only helped him because she was afraid the old man would see his injuries and punish Gu Yao. But by then, Gu Yixun was already head over heels in love with her. Honestly, when I heard that story, I just stared at my wine bottle, speechless. I'd imagined 100 different reasons why Gu Yixun loved Song Xiao, but I'd never guessed it was all because of a single band-aid. Timing really is everything, isn't it? If someone handed Gu Yixun a band-aid now, he'd probably call security and have them escorted off the premises for being a lunatic. No one had ever loved him unconditionally as a child, not even his own mother. So a tiny act of kindness, a single band-aid, had been enough to make him fall for her. Later, Gu Yixun had worked tirelessly to get dual degrees from one of the most prestigious universities in the country, excelling in 2 of the hardest majors. His academic achievements had made him stand out among all the Gu family's young heirs, turning him into Gu Yao's biggest rival for the family fortune. That was when he'd confessed his love to Song Xiao. She'd neither accepted nor rejected him, stringing him along until Gu Yao had secured his position as the heir apparent using his family connections. Only then had she finally turned Gu Yixun down. So how could I ever let him give his heart to a woman like that? Gu Yixun started appearing in my life again. It was like we were back in Jiangkang, those 5 years we'd spent together, chatting, drinking, eating dinner, taking walks. We never talked about the past. It was an unspoken rule between us. Until one day, he looked at me and asked, "Lin Ji, can we start over?" His eyes were dark and intense, his gaze fixed on mine. He sounded like he was struggling to get the words out, like it was the hardest thing he'd ever had to say. He'd grown up in a world of constant competition, with no one to rely on but himself. He was always guarded, his thoughts impossible to read. I asked him, "Gu Yixun, do you love me?" He stared at me confused. I smiled and changed the subject, pointing up at the sky. "Look at the moon tonight." We both lifted our heads. It was a perfect full moon, something you didn't see very often. It hung high in the sky, peeking through thin, wispy clouds. Being friends is nice, Gu Yixun, I said softly. Friends last forever. He looked stunned, like he'd never expected me to turn him down. He stared at me for a long time, speechless. We continued to see each other casually for the next few months, until Zhang Yan showed up in town, looking for me. He'd come to collect on the favor Gu Yixun owed him. When he saw me, his eyes lit up, and he sauntered over with a smile. Lin Ji, long time no see. You're even more beautiful than I remember. I smiled back at him, noticing Gu Yixun standing off to the side, his gaze fixed on us. His expression was darkening by the second. Zhang Yan started courting me. He'd wait for me on set, send me flowers, ask me out to dinner. I didn't turn him down, letting him court me slowly, testing the waters. Sometimes Gu Yixun would show up while Zhang Yan was with me. He'd ask me, his voice tight, "Do you like Zhang Yan?" I'd hug the bouquet of roses Zhang Yan had given me, smiling ambiguously. I don't dislike him, I said it deliberately, pretending not to notice the way his lips turned down at my answer. On Valentine's Day, Zhang Yan asked me out. On the way home, I noticed a car following us at a distance. I turned to Zhang Yan and asked, "Wanna come up to my place for a drink?" He glanced at the car behind us and laughed. I'm starting to feel sorry for Gu Yixun. He's just slow to stubborn to admit how he feels. But torturing him like this is a little cruel, don't you think? Then he grinned, looking amused. On second thought, I love watching him squirm. It's not every day you see the great Gu Yixun lose his cool like this. I led Zhang Yan up to my apartment. We stood by the window together, watching the car park downstairs. Gu Yixun was leaning against the door, smoking a cigarette, his head bowed. Zhang Yan laughed, nudging me playfully. Wanna make a bet? How long do you think it'll take him to come upstairs and ring the doorbell? I watched as Gu Yixun started pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. I smiled. 10 minutes. No sooner had I said it than Gu Yixun froze, as if something had finally clicked. He stubbed out his cigarette on the ground and strode toward the building, determined. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Yes, this was my final move. I'd asked Zhang Yan to help me put on a show. I needed to push Gu Yixun to force him to finally confront his feelings, to make him admit once and for all whether he loved me. Zhang Yan clapped me on the shoulder, grinning. You win. Go answer the door. I walked toward the door, a smile playing on my lips, as the doorbell rang again and again, growing more and more urgent. Yes, I'd won. Why should I be the one chasing him forever? If I kept running after him, he'd always take me for granted, never realizing how much I meant to him. The people you think will never leave are the ones you cherish the most when you almost lose them only to get them back again. I knew Gu Yixun would never meet anyone else like me. No one else would have stayed by his side when he was at his lowest, or walked away gracefully when he made it big. He might doubt a lot of things in life, but he'd never doubt my love for him. A love that was pure, fierce, unconditional. He'd finally surrendered to that love. I knew that after tonight, I'd hold a place in his heart that no one else could ever take. No one would ever be more important to him than me. Chasing the moon is exhausting. I wanted the moon to come to me, until he looked at me and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was the only one for him.